Most economists believe that at the end of next year, Canada's GDP will not have recovered to where we were at the beginning of 2020. Le 23 septembre prochain, le gouvernement énoncera sa stratégie de relance dans le discours du trône. La Chambre de commerce du Canada a présenté récemment sa feuille de route vers la reprise qui énonce 9 défis économiques que nous devrons relever. Ce document décrit comment nous pouvons réussir une reprise menée par les entreprises qui ouvrira la voie à une plus grande prospérité. Now, Canada's monetary policy, which is set by the Banque of Canada, will be an essential element in Canada's recovery strategy. As everyone is aware, yesterday the bank left its key lending rates unchanged. In its commentary on the state of the economy, the bank stated that it, quote, continues to expect the strong reopening phase to be followed by a protracted and uneven recuperation phase, which will be heavily reliant on policy support. The pace of the recovery remains highly dependent on the path of the COVID-19 pandemic and the evolution of social distancing measures required to contain its spread, close quotes. Governor Macklem will discuss the bank's policy as well as addressing the uneven effects of COVID-19 on different sectors and people in the economy. After his formal remarks, Governor Macklem will join us for a 15-minute question and answer session moderated by our Chief Economist, Dr. Trevin Stratton. Pre-registered participants will have the opportunity to submit questions through the Slido app. You will have received information about how to use the app when you registered. Now, we're particularly pleased that Tiff Macklem is joining us so early in his tenure. Governor Macklem took up his new role on June 3rd, accepting an appointment that will run for 7 years. Né à Montréal, M. Macklem a obtenu un baccalauréat en économie de l'Université Queen's en 1983 et une maîtrise et un doctorat en économie de l'Université de Western Ontario. He first joined the Bank of Canada in 1984 and held a succession of posts within the bank, including becoming a deputy governor in December 2004. During the global financial crisis, Mr. Macklem was Associate Deputy Minister at the Department of Finance and served as Canada's representative at the G7, G20, and Financial Stability Board. In July 2010, Mr. Macklem returned to the bank and was appointed Senior Deputy Governor. Now, prior to his appointment as Governor, Mr. Macklem was Dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, a role that he assumed in July of 2014. In times of crisis, it's certainly reassuring to know that there's an experienced, steady hand on the tiller, and it would be hard to think of anyone who could come to this job better prepared to successfully set the course. Tiff, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Per, and that was a very kind introduction. And let me take this opportunity to thank you for your leadership and underline the important work of the Chamber. I'm very pleased to connect with you virtually to discuss our interest rate decision yesterday, as well as some of the challenges facing the Canadian economy in this recovery. Tomorrow marks 6 months since COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic. Since then, this disease has taken a huge toll in lives and livelihoods. In the first half of 2020, it caused the biggest global downturn since the Great Depression. Au Canada, l'économie a connu la plus grande baisse jamais enregistrée au deuxième trimestre. Le PIB a chuté d'environ 13% au cours du premier semestre. Lors du cru touché en avril, environ 3 millions de Canadiens étaient sans emploi et des millions d'autres avaient un horaire de travail réduit. Cette récession a été exceptionnellement grave. Elle est aussi inhabituelle par la façon très inégale dont elle frappe les entreprises et les particuliers. Les fermetures d'entreprises et les pertes d'emplois ont été moins importantes dans les secteurs qui ont pu s'adapter rapidement au travail à distance et aux transactions en ligne. Par contre, les secteurs exigeant des contrats étroits et les employés de ces secteurs ont été durement touchés. Il s'agit principalement des branches du secteur des services dont les travailleurs, souvent les femmes, des jeunes et des petits salaires, ont subi le gros de l'impact. As Canada's central bank, we set monetary policy to help create the conditions for broad-based growth and opportunity. Very uneven recessions tend to be longer and have a larger impact on the labor market. So uneven outcomes for some can lead to poorer outcomes for all. Thus, even if monetary policy cannot target specific sectors, it's important for us to understand the uneven impacts of this recession and to make policy decisions that support lasting, broad-based growth. Today, I'm going to talk about the uneven impact that COVID-19 is having on the different sectors and people, the role policy plays in boosting growth with benefits that can be widely shared, and Governing Council's decision yesterday to keep our policy rate unchanged and to maintain our quantitative easing program. Afterwards, I'll be very happy to take your questions and engage in a discussion. In our July monetary policy report, we saw the recession and recovery playing out in three phases: containment, reopening, and recuperation. We expected the strong growth of the reopening would give way to a slower and bumpier recuperation. And as a result, the economy would take a long time to get back to where it was at the end of 2019, before the pandemic. Data released since July suggests the bounce back has been a little stronger than we had anticipated. By August, almost 2 million jobs have been recouped. That's roughly 2/3 of the job losses through March and April. This is very encouraging. But the pandemic has put us in a very deep hole, and we still have a long climb ahead. For some sectors, the hole has been deeper, and the climb back will be longer. Fields where remote work is possible have generally not experienced widespread job losses. And essential workers, such as hospital staff, first responders, and grocery store employees, had to keep working despite the pandemic. We're very grateful to them. But workers in several service industries, such as restaurants, retail, travel, saw devastating job losses during the containment phase, and these sectors are recovering only slowly. Many of the businesses in these industries have closed, and many of those that have reopened are operating well below capacity. The latest data from Statistics Canada show that air transportation in June was still down 94% from February, and the food services industry was operating 40% below pre-pandemic levels. This unevenness across sectors is disproportionately affecting lower income jobs. Remote work tends to be possible in higher paying occupations. Jobs in service industries most affected tend to be lower paying, part-time, with fewer benefits. As you can see in this slide, job losses were much greater for workers at the low end of the income scale. These jobs tend to be held by women and youth. Women make up 47% of the labor force, but about 56% of the accommodation and food services sector. Young people aged 15 to 24 make up about 40% of that sector, more than 3 times their share of the labor force. Before the pandemic, the labor participation rate for women was closing in on the long-standing gap with men. This trend has reversed. You can see the relative change in participation rates in this slide, with men in blue and women in red. The difference is especially stark in the 15 to 24 age group. The female participation rate during the containment period, the female participation rate fell during the containment period and is not recovering as quickly as the male participation rate in most age groups. The closing of schools and daycares kept many parents at home, especially women, who tend to take on more of the responsibility for childcare. This slide shows the issue quite clearly. It compares the drop in hours worked between mothers and fathers with children of different ages. And you can see that from February to April, mothers saw their hours worked fall further than fathers did across all ages. Now let's look at the current situation. You can see that fathers have gained most of their lost hours, while the recovery for mothers is slower, no matter the age of the children. How quickly this can be turned around depends on the reopening of schools, how it plays out, and whether at-home learning arrangements allow parents to work. Les jeunes ont été particulièrement éprouvés par les pertes d'emploi et les réductions des heures de travail. À un certain moment, plus de la moitié de la main-d'œuvre potentielle dans ce segment de la population était sous-utilisée. Et parmi les jeunes travailleurs, les femmes ont été bien plus touchées que les hommes. Finally, although the data is not as complete for visible minorities and Indigenous peoples, available data suggests that these groups have fared worse during the pandemic than other Canadians. For example, Statistics Canada reported that in August, the unemployment rate for younger members of visible minorities is almost 15 percentage points higher than for other Canadian youth. Moreover, as of August, employment for Indigenous people living off reserve was still almost 9% below its February level, compared to just over 3% for non-Indigenous Canadians. Incomes have been much less affected than employment, thanks to government programs like CERB. And government wage support programs are helping workers stay connected to their employers. Many of the job losses from COVID-19 are temporary layoffs. Still, young people and women are more likely to have been laid off permanently. Take a look at this slide. It shows that from February to April, a larger proportion of women lost their job in a permanent layoff as compared to men. And when we break down job losses by age, we see permanent job losses were much more common among people aged 15 to 24 than those 25 and older. On average, people who are laid off permanently take twice as long to return to work as people on a temporary layoff. This risks long-term damage to their prospects. High unemployment for young people, for example, has been shown to have a lasting drag on their incomes. Now, we've known for years that good policy frameworks can help set up a virtuous cycle of sustainable growth with declining inequality. Over the past 40 years, Canada has done a better job than many advanced economies in promoting growth that is shared. This slide shows a measure of income inequality known as the Gini coefficient. The lower the Gini coefficient, the less inequality there is. You can see Canada is just below the OECD average in this measure, while the United States is near the top end of the range. So while Canada and the United States have seen almost identical average growth since about 1980, our growth has been achieved with less income inequality. Income inequality rose in many countries in the 1980s and 1990s, including in Canada. But in our case, it peaked about 2006 and has been trending down to stable since then, as you can see in this slide. Before the pandemic, years of strong labor market growth brought Canada's unemployment rate to the lowest in 4 decades. People who had given up looking for work found jobs and returned to the labor force. Unfortunately, the pandemic has undone these employment gains and more. Moreover, COVID may accelerate some of the global forces that are making growth less inclusive. The use of digital technology has accelerated as COVID drives households and businesses to do more online. And like earlier waves of innovation, digitalization can be expected to lead to broad economic gains and higher living standards over time. But there are risks, particularly in the transition. In the early days, lower and middle income workers are likely to bear much of the initial cost of displacement. There are also other ways that the pandemic could narrow opportunity. The commodities boom of the mid-2000s was good for both growth and economic opportunity in Canada. Higher prices for oil and other resources helped raise wages for workers in those sectors and reduce poverty rates in energy-producing regions. And long-distance commuting to the oil patch also helped increase wages elsewhere in Canada. The resource sector continues to be an important source of employment in many regions. Lower global demand for oil, though, means investment and hiring in that industry is likely to remain weak, and some projects may never come back on stream. I hope by now you're convinced that this has been an exceptionally severe and also very uneven recession. And because of this, the fiscal and monetary policy responses have been unprecedented. Fiscal policy has taken the leading role, with the government scaling up existing programs and introducing entirely new ones to bridge Canadians through this sharp downturn. Measures like CERB and the wage support programs have replaced lost incomes, providing a cushion for families, especially low-income families. To help during the reopening of the economy, the government has extended its wage subsidy program and is changing CERB into an expanded employment insurance program. These programs are keeping workers connected to employers and the unemployed connected to the labor force, and that's supporting recovery. La Banque du Canada a également réagi à la crise économique avec rapidité et détermination. Nous avons abaissé le taux directeur pour l'établir à sa valeur plancher, qui est de 25 points de base. Nous avons aussi lancé une série de programmes d'achat de soutien à la liquidité. Au début, pour maintenir l'accès au crédit, et depuis, pour assouplir les conditions monétaires pendant la réouverture de l'économie. Alors que nous passons maintenant de la phase de réouverture à celle de récupération, la Banque fait tout son possible pour soutenir la croissance et permettre aux Canadiens de reprendre le travail. Le meilleur moyen d'améliorer de façon durable la situation économique est de prévenir les séquelles associées aux pertes massives d'emplois, c'est de remettre la population au travail. En abaissant le coût de crédit, nos politiques préparent le terrain pour que les consommateurs puissent dépenser et que les entreprises puissent investir. En arrimant nos actions à nos cibles, nous soutiendrons l'économie pendant toute la durée de la reprise. Nous l'aiderons aussi à retrouver sa pleine capacité et le plein emploi. C'est ce que nous pouvons faire de mieux pour améliorer les opportunités pour tout le monde. Striving for equality of opportunity is simply the right thing to do. It's also good for growth. The lost jobs for women, youth, and low-wage workers is a problem for us all. If these workers become discouraged and leave the labor force or lose valuable skills over time, their reduced economic participation will lower our potential growth, limiting living standards for everyone. More generally, as highlighted in recent years by the G20, inequality can make economies less resilient. The Bank of Canada's policy framework is up for renewal next year, and we are already in the middle of a comprehensive review before COVID came along. As Senior Deputy Governor Carolyn Wilkins said recently, we are exploring different frameworks to compare how effectively they support price stability and the economy and jobs. And this includes the distribution of income and wealth. We're asking Canadians to take part in an online survey called Let's Talk Inflation to tell us how changes in the economy are affecting them and their communities. This will inform our review and help us understand how monetary policy affects people and their economic decisions. Our experience with the pandemic gives us plenty to think about. And as part of our review, we are also studying the effects of our tools, such as large-scale asset purchases like government bonds. Along with many other central banks, we've been using this tool since March to stimulate the economy through a process known as quantitative easing, or as we call it, QE. The use of these tools by central banks around the world is still relatively new, and we are assessing their effectiveness. The experience of the global financial crisis in other countries has led some to argue that QE contributed to inequality by boosting the prices for financial assets held by wealthier people. It's true that QE works through many channels, including financial portfolios, and this could boost wealth inequality. But as research on the experience with QE in the United States and the euro area highlights, QE can also reduce income inequality. That's because lower borrowing costs stimulate economic activity, which in turn boosts jobs and incomes, particularly for low-income workers. Research on this topic is ongoing, both internationally and here in Canada, and we will continue to monitor all the effects of QE. In summary, we know that monetary policy is a broad macroeconomic instrument that cannot target specific sectors or workers. But growth and how it is shared are not independent. The stronger and more durable the recovery, the more opportunity there is for everyone. And the more opportunity there is for everyone, the stronger the recovery and the more durable is growth. So let me now conclude with a few words about yesterday's policy announcement. In our deliberations, the Governing Council naturally spent a lot of time reviewing the latest incoming data. We saw that the Canadian and global economies are evolving largely in line with the scenario we laid out in July. After shrinking just over 13% in the first half of this year, the Canadian economy has bounced back even a little more strongly in the reopening phase than we had anticipated. Employment has rebounded, although as I've reviewed at length, this rebound has been uneven. L'économie bénéficie des mesures de soutien budgétaire considérables prises pour protéger les plus vulnérables, remplacer les revenus perdus et subventionner les salaires. La Banque a ajouté à cet effort en maintenant l'accès au crédit et en diminuant les coûts d'emprunt. Les baisses de taux directeur combinées à notre programme d'assouplissement quantitatif ont aidé à réduire les taux d'intérêt pour tous les ménages et les entreprises depuis le bout de la pandémie. With credit markets functioning well, demand for our short-term liquidity facilities has declined, and uptake on our provincial and corporate bond programs has been relatively modest. The provincial and corporate bond programs will continue as announced, and the bank stands ready to adjust our short-term liquidity facilities as market conditions warrant. Well-functioning credit markets and considerable monetary policy stimulus have supported growth through the reopening phase. In fact, we've seen more household spending, particularly on goods and housing, than we were expecting, largely reflecting the release of pent-up demand. Exports are also recovering as foreign demand picks up, although they remain well below pre-pandemic levels. Despite this good news, members of the Governing Council still expect the recuperation phase to be slow and choppy. We don't expect the strong rebound we've seen in recent months to continue at the same pace in the months ahead. Business confidence and investment remain subdued. And more fundamentally, uncertainty about the future course of the pandemic will continue to restrain the economy, particularly in sectors that involve close contact. And the pandemic itself is accelerating several structural challenges, some of which I've already mentioned, to which the economy will need to adjust. The Governing Council also discussed inflation and its outlook. With CPI inflation now close to zero and downward pressure coming from energy prices, travel services, and economic slack more generally, we expect inflation to stay well below the 2% target in the near term. Our core measures have drifted lower, and this is consistent with the unused capacity in the economy. Nous pensons donc que pendant la transition de la réouverture à la récupération, des mesures de politique monétaire exceptionnelles devront continuer de soutenir l'économie. C'est de cette façon que nous pourrons favoriser le retour de l'économie à sa capacité et celui des gens sur le marché du travail. Le conseil de direction maintiendra le taux directeur à sa valeur plancher jusqu'à ce que les capacités excédentaires de l'économie se résorbent pour que la cible d'inflation soit atteinte de manière durable. Pour renforcer cet engagement et garder les taux d'intérêt bas sur tout le cours de rendement, la Banque poursuit ses achats à grande échelle d'actifs au rythme actuel. Ce programme d'assouplissement quantitatif sera maintenu jusqu'à ce que la reprise soit bien engagée et sera modulé de façon à procurer le niveau de détente monétaire nécessaire pour soutenir la reprise et atteindre notre objectif d'inflation. So we on Governing Council agreed that as the economy shifts from reopening to recuperation, it will continue to need extraordinary monetary policy support. This is how we can help bring the economy back to capacity and help people get working again. The Governing Council will hold the policy interest rate at the effective lower bound until economic slack is absorbed so that the inflation target is sustainably achieved. And to reinforce this commitment and keep interest rates low across the yield curve, the bank is continuing its large-scale asset purchase program at the current pace. This QE program will continue until the recovery is well underway and will be calibrated to provide the monetary policy stimulus needed to support the recovery and achieve our inflation objective. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Governor Macklem, for those fascinating remarks and analysis. These are certainly historic and challenging times for the Canadian economy and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and the entire business community. Thank you and the Bank of Canada for your efforts to support all sectors and people in the economy. I'm Trevin Stratton, the Chief Economist at the Canadian Chamber. Before getting started, I want to inform those viewing today that the Governor's remarks with the graphs is available on the bank's website. That's bankofcanada.ca and banqueducanada.ca. I also want to remind the members of the Canadian Chamber and the Canadian Business Resilience Network that registered for this webcast that for the next 15 minutes, we will be conducting a Q&A session with Governor Macklem. So you can enter your questions in the online platform in English and French, and we will try to get through as many as possible in the time permitted. So we already have one question that has come in, and that is, the COVID pandemic has placed a once obscure economic theory, modern monetary theory, or MMT, at the center of monetary policy debates. What are your thoughts on the main tenets of MMT, and do you side more with its proponents or with more mainstream economic theorists? Governor Macklem?
You won't be surprised. I'm siding more with mainstream economic theorists. But as you suggested, Trevin, the fact that central banks, many central banks around the world, are engaging in large-scale asset purchase of government bonds is causing some people to talk more about MMT, and it's giving it a sort of superficial veneer of legitimacy. I want to emphasize a couple of things. First of all, our quantitative easing program is anchored in the achievement of our inflation target. As I think I was very clear, it's a part of our extended toolkit, and with our policy rate at the effective lower bound, we're using QE to support the recovery and get inflation back to target. So while there's some similarity in the tools of MMT, the objective is very different. And when you look at MMT, there's really no evidence in history that it's worked. In fact, when monetary policy has been directed to supporting government deficits and underwriting the government, it's ended badly. So yes, you can see I'm not a big fan.
Thanks for that, Governor Macklem. We have another question that has come in. Celui-là est en français. Alors, vous avez participé récemment au symposium économique de Jackson Hole, où des dirigeants de banques centrales, des décideurs et des économistes se réunissent chaque année pour discuter des grands enjeux économiques à l'échelle mondiale. Quels sont les principaux points que vous avez retenus sur l'état de l'économie mondiale et quel niveau de coordination y a-t-il entre les banquiers centraux?
D'accord. En termes de grandes lignes en Jackson Hole, je vais souligner trois choses. Premièrement, il y a une expérience assez commune entre les économies avancées. Nous avons tout avec l'expérience d'une forte réduction de PIB au premier semestre cette année. Et nous tous, nous sommes maintenant dans la phase de réouverture et on voit une reprise très forte au Canada, aux États-Unis, en Europe. Mais mes collègues ont aussi souligné que la pandémie est avec nous, le virus est encore avec nous, l'incertitude est élevée et je pense que tout le monde pense que après cette forte croissance dans la phase de réouverture, le taux de croissance va diminuer. Deuxièmement, on voit quand on regarde le monde que l'expérience des pays émergents est plus mixte. En quelques-uns, la pandémie est presque arrêtée et leurs économies vont assez bien. En d'autres pays, par exemple, Brésil, Inde, la pandémie il est encore très fort et leurs économies ont plus d'effets de cette pandémie. Et finalement, je pense que troisièmement, ces conférences et surtout les réunions internationales sont très utiles en comparer nos expériences. Quelques pays sont plus avancés que d'autres. On peut s'apprendre des expériences des autres. Au sujet de coopération internationale, pour les banques centrales, c'est très fort. Après beaucoup de réunions d'urgence, emergency meetings, en mars et avril. Maintenant, nos réunions régulières sont en train, comme tout le monde, sont en ligne, sont pas en personne. Dans les semaines passées, j'ai assisté à des réunions organisées par le BRI en Bâle. Et oui, je trouve ces réunions très utile. Nous tous, on utilise des différents outils, l'assouplissement quantitatif, mais l'implémentation dans les différents pays, c'est un peu différent et donc on peut beaucoup s'apprendre d'écouter l'expérience des autres.
Merci, gouverneur. And I imagine a lot of people will find that reassuring that there is that level of cooperation internationally. We have a third question here. What is the plan to combat inflation over the coming years? Would the Bank of Canada adopt the same stance as the Fed, being more inclined to allow inflation to run higher than usual before raising interest rates? And is there any appetite for negative interest rates?
Okay, you packed a lot in that question. Let me try to take them in turn. First of all, let me congratulate my colleagues at the Fed on their revised policy statement with respect to their framework. I want to applaud the openness and transparency of the process, as well as I think it is an important evolution, represents an important evolution of inflation targeting. As I emphasized in the previous question, we're all learning from each other, and inflation targeting is no exception. Canada, we've been inflation targeting now for almost 30 years. And some of the things the Fed has done reflect things that we've been doing for some time. For example, they've moved to a regular 5-year review of their framework, something we've been doing for some time. And I think the clarifications they outlined in their framework exploit the flexibility of the framework, and that has been something that has been very much at the center of our reviews over time. With respect to this issue of average inflation targeting, or flexible average inflation targeting, as the Fed indicated, I think this is an interesting evolution of inflation targeting, and it is something we'll certainly be looking at closely. As I mentioned in my remarks, we are undertaking our own review of our inflation targeting framework. That got underway almost a year ago. A couple of weeks ago, we had a research conference outlining the results. And as I mentioned, we've been inflation targeting now for almost 30 years. And with that in mind, we felt it was time to do a really thorough review of the framework. And as part of that, there's a horse race looking at alternatives. One of those is average inflation targeting. And the preliminary results that were discussed last week and Carolyn Wilkins talked about, what they show is that there's no clear winner relative to inflation targeting. In circumstances, average inflation targeting has some benefits, but those benefits hinge importantly on people really understanding the regime, and that really comes down to the importance of listening to Canadians and communicating with Canadians. And as part of our review, we want to hear from Canadians. And as I mentioned in my remarks, a couple of weeks ago, we launched an online survey. It's called Let's Talk Inflation. And to every Canadian out there, I really hope you'll take 10 minutes, go on the Banque du Canada website, click on Let's Talk Inflation, fill out the survey, share it with your friends, share it with your parents, your kids. We want to hear from you. We want to hear from Canadians. How do price changes affect you? How does the economy affect you? And how are you making economic decisions? And that will feed into our review.
Thanks, Governor Macklem, and that's a very important consultation, and we certainly encourage everyone that's online today to fill that in as well. So the next question we have, and they're really rolling in now, is that they say never waste a crisis. Is this our opportunity to incentivize a green recovery and incentivize demand for green products produced in Canada, and perhaps further to products that support the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, as we move forward, I think I'm talking to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I'm talking to the business community. It is going to be important to build the economy of the future. I think with respect to climate change, there's no question we're going to need to accelerate our own efforts to deal with this force. Climate change is accelerating, and we're going to have to pick up the pace if we're going to successfully meet this challenge. With respect to the Bank of Canada, it's going to be very important for us to understand how climate change and the response to it, and frankly the adaptation to climate change, because some effects are already irreversible. It's going to be very important for us to understand how that's affecting the Canadian economy and the Canadian financial system. And one of the things that we're starting to look at is how could we work with the financial sector to look at alternative scenarios in climate change and how that would affect the financial system and the Canadian economy. So yes, don't waste a crisis. But the first and most important part is we've got to sustain this recovery. We've got to get Canadians back to work. We've got to get companies investing again. That's a precondition for growing the economy of the future.
That is definitely a message and precondition that the entire business community can get behind. And on that note of reopening and recovery, we have the next question, which is, does the Bank of Canada feel that Canada has fully moved out of the reopening period? And does the bank have any predictions on the possible length of the recuperation period?
It's these phases are going to overlap to some extent. We're certainly well advanced in the reopening phase, and we're now moving into the recuperation phase. And the message there really is we were in a very deep hole. We have climbed part way back out, but we still have a long way to go. There are still more than 1 million Canadians who lost their jobs who are not back at work. And it's probably going to take longer to recover that million jobs than it took to get the first 2 million back. So we still have some ways to go.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for the Q&A session. Once again, Governor Macklem, thank you for taking the time to address the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. The Canadian business community looks forward to working together with you and the Bank of Canada in helping all sectors and people in our economy recover from the uneven effects of COVID-19. I would now like to invite Madame Monique Leroux to provide closing remarks. Madame Leroux.
Thank you so much, Trevin. Merci beaucoup. Alors, I am Monique Leroux, Chair of the Industry Strategy Council and Vice Chair of Fiera Capital Holdings. On behalf of all of us, I would like to thank the Governor for his remarks today and for the lively and stimulating conversation with Trevin. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Gouverneur, de vos propos. J'ai eu le bonheur de vous connaître lorsque j'étais présidente du Mouvement des Jardins et c'était durant une autre crise, la crise financière de 2008-2009, et j'ai pu apprécier à ce moment-là votre compréhension des enjeux et surtout votre approche extrêmement dynamique et constructive à identifier et à mettre en œuvre des solutions. I find myself in a unique position as chair of the Industry Council and as a member of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce Council for Women Advocacy. I have this very special opportunity to bring the perspectives of Canadians from all sectors to ensure that we have an economic recovery underway, but inclusive. One of the big issues we are facing is that we need to get Canadians back to work and back to school, and it was so well expressed and discussed by the Governor. In these very difficult times, all people, women, men, students, Indigenous peoples, need support to get meaningful jobs and effective access to training, upskilling, and reskilling opportunities. However, and the Governor was so clear in his remarks, women everywhere in Canada are facing additional pandemic-related challenges about their working lives. These are very important issues that the Council for Women Advocacy, led by the Chamber of Commerce, is urging government to resolve. And of course, there are important proposals, and I'm very proud to be part of that initiative. Je tiens à remercier la Chambre de commerce du Canada et son président, M. Perrin-Betty, pour la contribution aux travaux du Conseil sur la stratégie industrielle et plus globalement pour l'économie canadienne. Et je tiens aussi à remercier plusieurs d'entre vous avec qui nous avons parlé durant cette période de consultation cet été. Merci beaucoup de vos recommandations et de vos remarques sur l'économie canadienne. En conclusion, I want to thank again the Governor. Your role and the role of the bank are very important and critical. But one thing that we know is that we can be assured that we have full confidence in the work that you are doing and that we are in very good hands and that you will lead us safely during this exceptional period of uncertainty. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Gouverneur.
Merci, Monique, pour votre confiance et merci pour votre leadership au sujet du Conseil stratégique. Et à tous les membres du Chambre, merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. C'est un grand plaisir. Bon après-midi.